Hi, everybody. We're going to get started. So I'm Lily. I'm with the events team here. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping items. The first one is if you could take out your cell phones and silence them so we don't disrupt the event. We also will have some time for Q&A towards the end of the event. We have a standing microphone right next to this white pillar. It might be hidden for some of you. We just ask that if you're able to, that you come to the microphone since we'll be recording and live streaming tonight, and we'd love to hear all your wonderful questions on the playback. So without further ado, tonight I'm excited to welcome Amelia Tseng, celebrating the release of her new book, Empanadas, Pupusas, and Greets on the Side, Language and Latinidad in the Nation's Capital. Amelia Tseng is Assistant Professor of Linguistics and Spanish in the Department of World Languages and Spanish at American University, where she's also an affiliate faculty member in the Department of Anthropology and the Center for Latin America and Latino Studies. She co-edited Bilingualism for All, Racial Linguistic Perspectives on Dual Language Education in the United States with Nelson Flores, Nicholas Subtirolu. She's also co-authoring the forthcoming Research in Heritage Speaker Bilingualism, Theories, Methods, and Designs, and is also on the editorial board of Bilingual Review or Revista Bilingüe. Singularly conversation with Dr. Wanda Hernandez, a cultural organizer and scholar from the DMV. She's an assistant professor of Central American and Latinx Studies at the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and Department of Mexican, American, and Latino Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Wanda's manuscript in progress examines Central American's personal archives of the Washington area. In addition to academia, she has curated exhibitions like Nuestras Historias, Latinos in Richmond, and produced community-based theater such as Little Central America 1984. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce Amelia Tseng and Dr. Wanda Hernandez.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, hello.
Making sure we're still awake at 7 p.m.
I know, my God.
Amelia, I'm so happy to be here with you. And I think we should go ahead and get started. Amelia, you wrote this fabulous book. And oftentimes when we're embarking on research projects, we start from a personal place. So I want to know a little bit more about who Amelia Tseng is and what brought you to write this book when you did.
Ooh, that's a good question. Wow, the mics are on. Look at all of us here. These are super high chairs. I'm a little distracted by that. Thank you all so much for being here. This is so excited. Thank you for being here and for having this conversation. It means a lot, especially since you're local. Mm-hmm. So I'm hoping we get to hear some of your thoughts, as well about life around here. And thank you also, Politics and Prose, so much for your many, many wonderful events and for having us here. So why this book? You know, what brought me here? Well, I'm a linguist, as you might have guessed. So, you know, sometimes it's like, well, what is that, right? Well, a linguist is like a language scientist, right? You just take a scientific approach to studying language. So again, huge tent, right? What is that? I'm a sociolinguist, so I look at language in its social and cultural context. And more specifically, I'm interested in things like bilingualism and identity and how language is part of your identity and how it changes over time, like from grandparents to kids and to grandchildren, right? But it's also a really personal book to me, right? So you might be looking at me like, wait, but hang on a sec, you're not Latina. And this is true, I am not. But I am from an immigrant family. And so in a sense, this has been a very personal type of story of, I suppose, coming to know myself and others for my whole life. Because like many, many children of immigrants, I grew up in a house where things were very different at home than they were outside. But being a kid, you don't really know how to process that. It's just sort of your reality, and it takes you a long time afterwards to think, well, that was different. Or, that thing somebody said once or did once, it kind of sticks in your mind, but you don't know what to do with it. You sort of file it for later. In my case, my family are immigrants from China. And, you know, so a lot of things were going on with that, socially, culturally, politically. But as a child, as with many kids, at home there were two languages. And as with many kids, me and my brother would respond in English. Yes, exactly. So that was the situation at home. But to complicate the situation, right, I also grew up in the Southwest. Anyone here from the Southwest? Yeah? Whereabouts? Where have we got here? Anyone?
Arizona, New Mexico,
Texas?
SoCal.
So the situation there is pretty different, right? I grew up in the Southwest. And so outside of the house, it was also a bilingual situation, but a very different one, right? It was Spanish-English bilingualism. And so I grew up, I would say, sort of very aware that there were different currents that people navigated, and that language, even though it was invisible, was actually a really important part of that. It was a really important part of how you could express yourself, of who you expressed yourself with, and of how people would react to you. But, I didn't have a language to really think about that, right? Not to make a pun there. I just sort of thought, well, okay, maybe my parents are weird, right? Or, well, maybe I'm just not very good at Chinese. It must be my fault somehow, right? And then I grew up, and when I first took a linguistics class, that was when my eyes kind of opened, and I thought, oh my God, it's not just me and my family being weird or doing anything wrong or even that special. People do this all over the world. This is a really common experience. And a lot of really smart people have dedicated a lot of time to figuring out how to examine this in a scientific way. I want to find out more. I want to see how I can make my contribution. So that's kind of the backstory.
Mm-hmm. I have a question that I want to ask you about
Absolutely.
that, but maybe I'll come back to it.
Sure.
My next question was about the research process.
Okay.
I know you moved to DC, you began your doctoral research.
Mm-hmm.
You spent 10 years accumulating data to write the book that you have in front of you right now. And I know
10
that
years of my life.
Yeah, 10 years.
10 years of my life.
And 2 children too.
And 2 children, yep. One in the middle, one at the end.
And I know when we're engaging in this research, right, when we're in the field, as we like to say, or in the archives, we sometimes have moments that are jinkies moments that make ideas clearer, or other moments that kind of like puncture us, right, like that touch us emotionally. And I was wondering if you had any one of those moments, whether it was an emotional reaction or a jinkies reaction, that has stuck with you and you'd care to share with us today.
Oh, so many. So many. I think the easiest way for me to do that is actually going to be to share a couple of quotes from the book. But there's so many more in here. And then I want to come back later to this idea of why this book, because I sort of talked about like my personal journey, but I didn't talk about why DC, which I feel like is going to be a question that's of a lot of interest to us here in the room. And even more so perhaps at this moment in time where DC is sort of in the spotlight and under the lens in a way that's not entirely unfamiliar to people here, but is maybe a little bit more pronounced than usual. Okay, so let me share a couple of examples with you from the book. Just to give a little bit of context here, yeah, I worked on this for a really long time. It started with my grad studies, but it didn't end there. It sort of grew and grew and grew, which is why it's a book and not an article. And part of why it grew and part of what I think is important is that we're talking about a bilingual community. And so I thought it was really important to talk about it bilingually, to talk about both the languages and how they interact, instead of sort of going, oh yeah, people are bilingual, but then focusing on English or Spanish one at a time. Because that's not how we live our lives, right? Whether you're bilingual or bidialectal or even, just living our lives, we experience our lives holistically, right? And while people code switch, it's not as cut and dry as like, oh, I'm going to switch between my brains or something like that. And so what I found when I started working on this actually was just DC and language and identity around here are so complex that the models I had trained in, which were mostly developed for other parts of the country, actually weren't able to get me the distance I needed them to here in the area. So I ended up kind of going off-road a little bit. But this is all a long way of me telling you, I'd like to share 3 anecdotes here. Or quotes rather, from some of the interviews I did. I have about 100 interviews in the book with people in the area. And, it being DC, there's people from all over the Spanish-speaking world. There's old people, there's young people, there's first-generation immigrants, there's people who came when they were kids or teenagers. There's people who were born here, like Wanda.
Born and raised. Shout out to Nova.
And so I really wanted to get a sense of, as the community has gelled over the past 50 years, which is something we can talk about, the history also if people are interested, how is language part of that, right? Language is such an important part of people's lives, but it sometimes doesn't really get the same airtime when we talk about these things. And I don't know why, right? I think maybe because it's intangible, unless you record it, it's just sort of gone. And yet it's everywhere, right? It's like water for a fish or the air we breathe. You can't do anything without it. So I thought, all right, in their own words, let's hear some of the things that people had to say. Question for y'all first. What's the big Latino group around here? Does anyone know? Hey, there we go. Salvadorians, right? That's the big local group. And a very proud community, one that's faced a lot of adversity and has built a lot of things out locally. But not the only group, right? What are some of the other groups around here? Mm-hmm. Guatemala, yep. Bolivians, yep. Panamanians, yep. Cubans, Dominicans, mm-hmm. Puerto Ricanos, yep, Peruvians. Yeah, from all over the place, right? There's people from literally all over the Spanish-speaking world here, which is very DC. People like to say very DC for a lot of things, right? But it is very DC. And one of the points I'd also like to make is that although this book is focusing on the DC Latino community, it's not alone, right? I mean, we could say the same for any other group here. There's people from all over the world. I mean, there's Tibetans, there's Mongolians, there's Koreans, there's Ethiopians. And within those groups, there's also a lot of diversity too. There's everyone from like embassy staff to undocumented workers. So there's a lot of diversity here that is not necessarily maybe the case everywhere you would go in the United States, right? I mean, for example, you're in Texas now, right? Demographics very different. It's like what, 80% Mexican most places?
Something like that. And even if like other cities are becoming increasingly more diverse in terms of not having only Mexicans, right? I think the way it's pronounced and how like prominent it is in DC makes the research like a no-brainer.
Okay, so I promised you some quotes, so let's hear a few. I am not obviously a DC Latino, and so I'm not going to attempt to reconstruct the pronunciation because I want to do justice to it, and I also want to be respectful. But I hope you get a sense of the personalities and the people behind these words. And where it's necessary, I will also sort of point out some linguistic stuff like, oh, code switching, or I'll tell you about some nuances of pronunciation. Okay, so here's a quote from someone whose fake name, to protect their privacy, is Emmanuel. Who was a middle-aged Salvadorian man. I'll also just note that in the book I have written this Salvadoran because that's what the copy editors said is the correct way to write the word. But whenever I talk to anyone, they say Salvadorian. And that comes more naturally to me, so that's what I'm doing here. Okay, so he says, another caveat. I'm a dork and I'm not comfortable swearing in front of audiences. So if you want to get the really vernacular version, check out the book. I'm just going to sort of dorkily beep through it or slide through it because I feel awkward. But Emmanuel, very funny guy. He says, talking about Salvadorians in the area, he said, we get made fun of being but we don't give a F word. And then he laughs. And I say, okay, there's more of you. And I laugh. And he says, yeah, but he corrects me because I sort of missed the point. No, but really, you know what I mean. We take pride in who we are, you know. I mean, and then I'm from the countryside, so, you know, I get teased both ways because, so yeah, but you know, it is what it is. So we are a very thriving community, you know, very entrepreneurial. There's loads of businesses in this area that belong to us, to peasants, people that started with washing dishes in restaurants and now own restaurants. And I say, good for them, good for them. And he says, yeah. And there's a bunch of stories like that. Yeah, or grocery store owners, there's a lot of them too. So here he's talking about being Salvadorian in DC, about the identity, but about the language specifically, right? So what does this tell us? And this is one of many, many quotes. I mean, I talked to 100 people. And this is one of the common themes. Well, it shows us that language is something on the radar, right? It's salient. It's a symbol of identity, but it also shows that he's got some conflict around it, right? There's definitely a sense of pride there, but there's a sense that there's a certain type of discrimination too, a certain type of stigma maybe or prejudice against it that he and other Salvadorians have experienced even from other Latinos. And he goes on to break it down, right? And those of you who are familiar with the area can really probably see how the local, the various immigration and local dynamics are behind that, right? Salvadorian Spanish, big wave of Salvadorians came in the 80s. Many people had to start over or build things up, mostly coming from a rural part of the country. And so you can hear him talking about that, about how there's an awareness of this stigma. He says, people say, you know, we talk like peasants, but there's also a pride and a defiance in that. And what I'd really like to point out here, there's a lot of other things we can talk about with that, but I don't want to get too far off the radar. What I really want to point out in terms of sort of the thrust of this book is that it's not just a Salvadorian pride he's talking about. It's a specifically local DC Washingtonian Salvadorian pride, because he's saying, in a sense, we belong here. We built this city. We built these communities, which is something that you will hear people say over and over, and even in places like the Washington Post, they say, we literally built this city, like we were the workers who did this. And it's a pride in what the community has achieved here as well, even though he's aware that others may look down on them for certain reasons. And so one of the things that I found really interesting there is that it's a local and it's a broader sort of ideology going on, right? There's a Washingtonian meaning there, a local pride and also a certain prejudice. See what I did there? But it's also international, right? These attitudes about what Spanishes are better or worse is not something that's homegrown in the United States. It's something we see elsewhere in the United States, like New York and LA and Miami, but it's not something that's coming from the States. We have our own prejudices here about Latinos, about colorism, about different groups that we're going to see in a sec, but it's coming from Latin America. So we're really seeing this sort of multi-level transnational thing where immigrants are coming here, but they're not coming to a vacuum and they're not a blank slate, right? I feel like this is not a surprise to any of us here in the audience, but it needs to be sort of documented anyway, right? Because often when we talk about these things in this country, it sounds like immigrants come as blank slates and they just sort of pop out of nowhere into this sort of mythical white bread middle America. And that's the context. But, who is America? We'll get to that. Like, who is Washington, D.C.? That's part of what people are grappling with. And where do these ideas that inform the identity come from? Well, they come from the home countries as well as here. I'll just throw out there also that there's more than one answer, right? So I asked, okay, what's the main Latino group around here? And everybody said Salvadorian, which we know, right? But when I asked people in these interviews and surveys, okay, so what's DC Spanish like? I got a good amount of people saying, well, it's Salvadorian, right? Which makes sense. Except for Salvadorians, they said things like, it's normal. Oh, it's normal. It's like in my country. It's normal. They sound like me. But there were also a lot of people who said, well, it's so diverse, I couldn't possibly give you an answer. And then they also typically went on to say things like, well, it's really nice. You get to learn about other people's cultures and things like that, which is another part of the story here. And I think it's really important to point out, right, that there doesn't have to be just one identity or one story in a community. Again, kind of preaching to the choir here, but I think it's important to point out, especially when we're talking about minoritized communities, because people often want there to be one story, right? One answer, one naming terminology, sort of pin it to the board in a static way, which is not fair because every community is very diverse.
Now, you keep on saying that it's perhaps normal or obvious to those in the audience, but I still think to reiterate how important it is to document and the nuances with which you do so. Like I recall I was at a Whole Foods talking to someone who worked there, and I said, cabal. He was like, where are you from? I said, my parents are from Guatemala, but I'm from Northern Virginia. And it turns out that cabal, I had no idea because it was so normal to my Spanish at home, is very typical of the Northern Triangle in Central America. So it was this sort of like, I see you type of moment that my Peruvian friend next to me was like, what does that mean? So just thank you for
Cool.
documenting that work.
Oh, wonderful. And I think that it's so important, again, because, the U.S. being what it is, there are other regions of the country that are much more studied when it comes to Latinx issues. And they deserve it, right? I'm not saying Texas doesn't deserve to be studied, California, Arizona. I mean, this is the Chicano heartland, right? This is the border. This is the area that was Mexico until about 150 years ago. So like, con razón, right? New York, Miami, those places. But DC is different. It's unique. It's special. And it deserves to be looked at as well, this community and all the other communities here. And it's a funny thing about DC, right, is that it's the capital, right? It's arguably the most powerful city in the world. Mm-hmm. And yet when people think about the United States, do they think about DC? What do people think about when they visualize the United States? New York, right? Where do people go when they come to visit the United States? New York, right? Maybe LA, yeah. And, what do people know about DC outside of DC here? Well, they think about West Wing, right? They think about the White House. They think about, Congress, maybe drain the swamp. Maybe some stereotypes from back in the day, like murder capital, stuff like that, right? But this sense of what is DC? Who is DC as a place? Who are the people? Who are the neighborhoods? What's the history of activism? That's something that is not just not really known so much until you come here. I know that I certainly didn't know about it. And I think that all these stories deserve to be told. Mm-hmm. Are we going on, or can I read some more anecdotes?
You can read some more anecdotes.
Okay, so, sorry, not anecdotes, data. There were so many interviews. People were so generous, and they were often quite funny, too. So this was great. Okay, so that was some examples of sociolinguistic attitudes, as we call them in the biz, from the Spanish side of things, right? And I should mention also, it's worth mentioning that there's really very little written on linguistics of the Latino community here in DC, but there is one study on dialect attitudes from 1985, and the results were very consistent with what I found as well. So the little excerpt I just read was a Salvadorian man talking about Salvadorian language, but I asked everybody else too, and as you might guess, they had thoughts. So if anyone had to guess, which Spanishes do you think ranked high when people thought about which ones were good and correct and stuff like that? And which ones do you think, sadly, ranked low? And this is data, right? We're not casting stones at anyone, but we're trying to document attitudes here. So which ones do you think went high and which ones were low? Colombia was high. Spain was high. Argentina was high. Mexico actually wasn't super salient to people, which is really surprising in the United States, where Mexican culture is really, really, really visible amongst Latinos, but maybe because it's a sort of uncharacteristically small proportion of the population here. Sure, so like Colombia, Argentina, Spain, those were all high. Why do you think that might be? Why is Spain up there? Is it because there's a huge Spanish population here in DC? Nope. It's because it's white, right? White, European, madre patria, colonialization, right? We could make a parallel argument also for what people sometimes say about American English, right? And the Queen's English and all that kind of stuff. I guess it's the King's English again now, since there's a king there. Sure. And if we had to think about what Spanishes came in low on the ranking, if you had to guess, which do you think might be some of them? Salvador and the Caribbean. Yeah, exactly. Why is that? Any Spanish linguists out there? Because of the ancestry, right? More African descent, more indigenous. There's also some colonial history in there, like which areas sort of were more developed to the current day, that kind of things. But Argentinian Spanish shares a lot of characteristics with Salvadorian Spanish. Boceo, S elision, which people normally just say se come la S, right? It was sort of remote during the colonial period, and people don't say the same mean things about Argentinians when they talk as they do about Salvadorians, which is how we know it's not just about the language, right? It's a funny thing. People often want to say language is sort of just this neutral thing. It gives a cover term, right? If it is, then why are people so all up in their feelings about pronouns? Right? You can't have it both ways. Like, is it just grammar or is it something really important socially, right? Maybe 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. But the point is, there's something going on there, right? So all of that also is very consistent with what Lucinda Hart Gonzalez found way back in 1985. So for whatever reason, these dialect attitudes seem to be pretty stable in DC, even given this Central American majority, even given how multicultural it is and how people are genuinely interested in diversity. And so what that tells us, right, is there's something consistent about those attitudes. And they're deeply, deeply social, right? They're tied to history, they're tied to race, they're tied to social class, they're tied to all kinds of things like that. Okay, so I made this big deal out of how we can't just look at one language at a time, right? So let's roll over to the English side of the multilingual repertoire. Your repertoire is just all the languages you speak and dialects and things, right? Okay, so here's a quote by a man named, fake name, Marcos. And when I interviewed Marcos, he was about to turn 40 and rather angsty about it. I don't know if that makes him middle-aged or not, but he was about to turn 40. He is of mixed Central American, Salvadorian, and Mexican ancestry and grew up in the DC area. Grew up in DC, spent some time on the Maryland side when he started getting into trouble, was sent back to El Salvador for a while, came back, did a few things, and it was then back in the city. So here's a quote from him talking about how things had changed. He was a proud Washingtonian. He said, "So that I like going to the farmers markets, not Eastern," and then he laughs, market, "but like Union Market, that's up and coming, but now do you see who's coming in? The outsiders. Who started Union Market? DC Washingtonians." And then I say, locals. Not exactly in that chirpy tone, though. Then he says, "Now who's doing it? Oh, New England chowder." This, what? We always joke and we want to make soul food and this and this and that because that's the DC we remember had cultural food, making empanada pupusas, but also having cauliflower greens and greens on the side too. That's DC, a fusion. Chocolate City, we used to be Chocolate City. Nobody knows who Chocolate City is. That was DC, Chocolate City. It was an infusion of whatever culture you had with the Black culture. So he said so many other things. It was a long interview. We talked several times. But there's a lot going on in this excerpt, right? What are some things that we can see here? What are some things that leaped out at you? Anyone? Food? Yeah, so we have cultural symbols going on, right? Food is a very clear sort of meta commentary on culture, right? He's got empanadas, pupusas, so traditional Latino foods and specifically iconic Salvadorian foods, the pupusa, right? Which has sort of become a thing in DC as identity too. There's like a pupusa festival and stuff like that. But he's also indexing, he's also using soul food, right? Cauliflower greens on the side. And then he brings it home and he says explicitly that it's a cultural mix and he's indexing Black culture. That was DC, Chocolate City, a mix of whoever you were with the Black culture. And at other points in the interview, he talked about music and stuff like go-go and cumbia and stuff like that. He talked about the clothes they used to have here in the 80s, their own clothing brand, things like that. So that's definitely part of how he's showing that fusion. Anything else that leaped out? Yeah?
He's indignant about clam chowder.
Oh, he's indignant about clam chowder. Yeah. I never would have thought that life would have taken me to a place where I got to talk about the indexicalities of clam chowder. And yet, here we are. He was indignant about the clam chowder. I mean, I don't know if he enjoys it himself in his personal life, but it was sort of standing in contrast, right, to empanadas and pupusas and greens and like the real DC. And he did put on a little voice when he was doing it, this sort of like, prissy sounding, oh, New England clam chowder sort of thing, as he's talking specifically about how it's sort of this invasive product that's coming in with these outsiders, right, as they colonize places like Union Market. And he, these are his words, not mine. Like he says outsiders and insiders, and he's talking about how DC used to be versus now. So we could keep unpacking that. There's a lot there, right? But I'd like to just sort of bring it back in a little more detailed way to the linguistics for a sec and point out that while he was doing this, besides the actual content of what he was saying and the sort of self and other identity construction he was doing, he was actually with his actual language, like the code switching on the Spanish words, but his actual pronunciations were also doing some stylistic work for him here. As he was talking, he was using features of Black English. He was using features of Latino English. And so it's sort of the identity, this blended identity he's talking about was coming across in the actual sound of his voice, as well as in the content of what he was saying. Unless anyone think maybe he was just faking it for the interview. He wasn't, no. You and I have talked about this, and I have another example coming up here, and we can talk about this more. But suffice it to say that cultural blend he's talking about carries over to language as well. This is not a case of like, a suburban hip hopper in the 90s who was sort of trying to, like a Beastie Boy type who was trying to put it on or something like that. Although the suburbs here are very, very diverse too. Not sort of traditionally what you'd think about. But no, this is what he grew up with. And as he actually told me at another time in the interview, he used to sound different. He said, I'm old now, I'm married, I'm middle class. Like I sound a lot more educated. I sound a lot more white than I used to. But this is not how I grew up talking. And yet even with that, as a linguist and as someone who's not from the area, these dialect features were actually pretty apparent in how he talked. And one can assume, right, that when he's just hanging out with his friends or something from home, he would be talking even more like that when he's hanging out with me being interviewed.
Thank you, Amelia.
Yeah.
It sounds like you arrived at a sort of new sonic understanding of DC. And so I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that. And not just DC, but the suburbs. Like you said, you had another example of Latinx people, some of whom are Black, some of whom are non Black, adopting Black English.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. And that brings me to my third example, which I really enjoy because it has to do with kids back in the 80s, and it's really fun. And then I have another example from Marcos here. Where did it go? So let me think here. Backing up. Right. So he was talking, right, about the cultural fusion that was going on around here, right? And this was particularly pronounced in the 80s. So many people might even remember that themselves, right? But so many people I talked to talked about that. They talked about the city in the 80s. They talked about how it was different. They talked about how things have changed. And that was the culture they were coming into. And this was something people were very clear about. Now, not everybody, right? It depended on who you were. It depended on where you lived. If you were like working for the embassy, your experience was probably a little different. But at the time they came, DC was still majority Black. And not just numerically, right? But with this proud local culture. And the sense of that changing and that being controversial is something that's been sort of going on and locally and in debates and in the news since the Black majority was lost in 2011, right? So this was the context that people were coming into. And I think that that's really important to point out too, because this idea recently of like, who are we as a country, right? Who is America? We're sort of having these massive cultural debates about it, but when it comes to things like immigrants and schools, there's still this assumption that's a little less questioned, right? That it's sort of middle-class white America. And that's just not true and hasn't been for a long time for many, many people. So that's another place where the DC region with all of its diversity is sort of like a testing ground, if you will, for trends that are going on in the rest of the country. The example I wanted to share is from my research at the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. And I have to shout out also here my mentor there, Olivia Cadaval, who just passed away this spring. We just did the memorials for her this weekend, and it was super moving. She was a wonderful lady. There's legislation in place to honor all the contributions she's made to DC and to the Latino community. She was my mentor at the Smithsonian and a dear friend as well. And she wrote the first book on the community here talking about the Latino festival. So thank you, Olivia. And she was a super cheerleader, and I'm really sorry. She knew the book came out, but she never got to have a copy. And I'm really sorry about that, but you know, she knows. Anyway, and she has more important things to think about than my book anyway, but I wanted to say thank you to her again because I miss her terribly. Anyway, when I was doing that work in the archives, I came across a really fabulous recording from the 80s, which was a whole bunch of little kids on a playground. And it was little girls mostly playing playground games, things like jump rope and the rhymes and stuff like that. But the really interesting and wonderful thing from a linguistic point of view was that you could tell from the way the little girls were speaking Spanish, and in particular the kind of English they were speaking, that they were learning English. It wasn't their first language. And it wasn't just Latino English either, which is different, right? It's different from learner English. Sometimes people hear a little different pronunciation, they just assume it's because you don't speak English, but it's not true, right? There's a whole separate dialect, mostly studied in LA, called Chicano English, which is sort of what happens in bilingual communities. But these little girls were very much learning English. And you could tell from listening to them, I could tell that the English they were learning was African American English. You could hear the pronunciations, you could hear the grammar, and you could hear the contact situation recorded because the kids they were playing with, their friends, were Black. You could hear the rhymes, you could hear the language, and their teachers were Black. And that was the situation that these kids were coming into, and that's where their repertoires were formed. Now, you know, people grow up and they move, and nowadays, what with prices being what they are in the city, a lot of people don't go directly to the city to live. And in any case, the communities have changed a lot. So the situation may very well be different out in the burbs. It's different in PG County than it is in Montgomery County, right, for example. But this was the situation these kids were coming into. And so I think that's important to note that while I'm definitely not saying there's nobody trying too hard in the city somewhere, I don't want to make that claim, this is different from sort of your classic case of language and cultural appropriation, right? Because everyone I talked to was aware of the origins of this way that they spoke, and they were honoring it, even as they also talked about how sometimes there had been conflicts between youths and stuff growing up. But this really was very much the natural English that these children acquired as they were growing up because of the context they were in. So, you know, it sort of goes to that question of when you go to a new place, what voice are you allowed to have? What is your culture supposed to be, and who gets to decide it? If it's not the kids that you grew up with, if that's not visible, then, what should it be? And I love that example. And Marcos also has one more quote here where he's talking about his son, because he was a proud Washingtonian, as I mentioned, and he was very committed to staying in DC despite the rising prices, in part because he had a child. And he said, I really want my son to have what I had, even though it'll be different. I want him to know his roots as a Washingtonian. So he was telling me all about that. And he said, yeah, he's awesome. And he has a little slang too. Yeah. He'll walk into the room, he'll see you, and you'll be like, oh, you're so cute. And he'll say, I already know. And I already know. But with that little accent, I already know. And I say, oh, yeah, he's got it a little, the accent, he's got a little. And Marcos says, yep, he's got a little bit of it. So, that's the awesome part, We do have our own language, our own music, our own dress, our own dance, our own everything. Like New York and LA, we have our own stuff here, too.
Thank you for sharing, Amelia. And perhaps this actually takes us very nicely to our last question, which I think is geared towards Latinx young people who I don't think there's any in the audience. But
Define young. Define young.
A couple right there.
Hey, hello.
Okay, hello. Well, Latinx young people.
I see some of y'all out there, some of my students.
They're oftentimes criticized for their language practices, right? They're either no sabo kids, they speak English with a Spanish accent or Spanish inflected accent, or in the DMV, in particular in DC, they speak African American English. And they're constantly criticized for their language practices. So what sort of advice do you have for Latinx young people who are navigating all these you're not speaking well enough attitudes?
Ooh, that's a question. I think it's, with this work, I think somebody called me once on a podcast a language therapist. I don't know about that, but on a deep level, I want people to know that they're okay. Although my situation was different, I also grew up sort of inadvertently being blamed for things. And to be clear, this comes from inside the house too, right? This comes from families and communities, often with really good intentions, right? I just want to help them speak correctly. It's really important to me that my child knows the language and the culture. But the net effect is sort of the same, right? This feeling that maybe you're doing it wrong, and what does that say about you? Oh, you're Americanized. Oh, you're rejecting the culture. Meanwhile, people outside the house are also assuming that you speak or don't a language based on how you look. Maybe they hear an accent, or maybe they just look at you and think they do, right? Whether they assume you speak your heritage language and then, get in your face for not doing it right, or they assume that you don't speak English and are sort of constantly amazed that you can, even when you're speaking it right there with them. This gets very put on the individual, I think. This gets very put on the individual, and kids internalize this, that they're somehow doing it wrong and it's somehow their fault. And I don't want them to think that. Language and culture are always evolving. I'm sure, 3,000 years ago, there were ancient Romans who were like, oh my God, the youth, they're Latin. It's so bad. It's so vulgar. Oh my God, those bilingual, Latin Spaniards over the Iberian Peninsula. Ugh, their Latin is so broken, Why don't they just sound like us here in Rome? You know what I mean? These are old, this is constantly going on. We love to criticize people, right? And yet 3,000 years later, we're not like, oh, that Latin's terrible. We're just like, oh, it's Castilian Spanish, right? Oh, it's French. It sounds so elegant. And so I want them to know that, right? Languages and culture and life are dynamic. It's a beautiful thing. And it makes sense that if you are bilingual, bicultural, your identity and your language and what you do with it is going to be different than someone with a different experience, because you didn't grow up in El Salvador, in Argentina, whatever. You grew up here, bilingually, biculturally. But for some reason, the standard is higher, right? And that can be a real double-edged sword, because if you learn, let's say, Spanish in class, people tend to be much more supportive than if you're supposed to speak it from home. And if you're supposed to speak it from home, there's this sort of idea that you're never quite good enough. because maybe your accent slips a little bit, or maybe you don't know all the words, or maybe you're more used to talking with your family than in a work situation, which is completely understandable, right? But even if you're perfect, then it's going to be like, well, maybe you don't read and write as well as you should. Or like, how come you don't sound as good as your cousin who did his master's degree in Argentina? And it's like, well, it's a little bit of a moving bar here. So I want people to know that it's not them, right? A lot of these sort of thoughts and assumptions, although they may not be coming from a bad place, it's bigger than any one person, certainly than any one child. Meanwhile, we have here the schools where the school system really sort of squeezes bilingualism out of kids. And then we try and, maybe put it back in college or something like that, right? So I want them to know, it's not you. There's new and hybrid cultures all over the place, and they're a beautiful thing. At the same time, I do feel very strongly that to take someone's language and culture away from them, whether it's more discreetly or maybe even inadvertently through things like policy, through things like educational practices, or something really deliberate, like often happened with wars of conquest or through colonization, something like that. I do feel that is a form of violence. This intangible heritage is still heritage, and people should have the right to continue it, even though it is also their right to not, quote unquote, speak perfectly and not be made to feel bad about that.
I don't know. It sounds like you're a language therapist. I just did some healing as a professor in the Department of Spanish.
Well, like I said, it's personal, right? I mean, I grew up with this too, and my friends did. And now, I have 2 little kids, right? They're more roots in the area. They're going to be little like DMV Asian Latinos. Yes. And one other thing I think is great about here is I feel like this is a part of the country where they'll be less likely to run into people just being like, well, where are you really from? You know what I mean? But at the same time, my son is 3 and I'm already having to sort of fight battles in a nice way with people who just will not believe, that he speaks Spanish or that his Chinese is not good enough to understand them or something like that. So it starts young.
Well, Amelia, I want to open it up to questions from the audience, but first I just want to thank you. We've lost some grand figures in the Latinx community here. Olivia Cadaval, Arturo Griffiths, even more recently. And I feel like you are carrying on the sort of mission that they've had their whole lives and passing it on. So now I'm going to get emotional.
Aw, I know.
And I'm a Cancer, so it's super stereotypical. But with that being said, thank you. If you all will join me with a grand round of applause for Amelia.
Thank you very much. And thank everybody for being here.
I appreciate you. And if the audience has any questions, we encourage you to come up to the microphone that's right over here to our left.
Thank you, by the way. I really appreciate what you said and how you said it. Personally, an immigrant and with complicated language background. But at one point, I was working in bilingual education, and I was at the Marie Reed School in D.C. And this is back in the 90s. And there were almost no white kids, either Latino or Black. And the teachers had such different teaching styles that it seemed very tense. From at one end of the spectrum, loving and everything's great and good and we'll hug you, and the other is you got to be disciplined and get it right and all that. And have you noticed that? Did you come across that in your research, this kind of diverse ways of teachers dealing with the language and cultural issues together?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
There were a range of people I talked to in terms of educational experience. And actually, a number of people said, like, oh, they never put me in ESL or anything like that. But other people said they put me in ESL and I didn't need it. So a lot of these sort of perceptions are still out there. But absolutely, even now, I think that's one of the important things about sort of unpacking some of the invisible currents in our minds, these ideologies and these beliefs that we are brought up with and don't really question about what's like a correct way to talk. And unpack a little about like, okay, what does that mean and why? Is there only one correct way to talk and why? Why can there only be one and who gets to decide? Precisely because we then go out in the world and we do our work, right? So as parents, as educators, as people doing all kinds of things, we bring those ideas with us, and often with really good intentions, we can be doing harm to a kid or an adult because we're enacting our practices based on those expectations. And it's an ongoing debate, right? I mean, with Black English, with immigrant languages, this idea basically of like, how do we help children succeed, right, when their home language and culture does not cleanly align with the expectations of the school? And is that, should we just try and help them sort of hide who they are, or switch who they are in different contexts, or should we try and change up the paradigm to be more accepting as well? So thank you so much for the question, because there's a lot of excellent work going on with that in critical education right now, but no one has found the answer. It's a work in progress. And of course, in DC, I don't have to tell you that so many of these things, are happening within institutions, which, are sort of beyond the control of the particular teachers or any particular individual. So it sort of remains to be seen what's going to happen with that, especially with like the DOE right now and things like that. Thank you.
Dr. Tseng, thank you so much for your book. As someone that, I've hit my 40s, as someone that grew up in the early 90s in Montgomery County, exposed to so many different cultures in the high schools I went to in Wheaton, I wanted to see if you came across other informal ways that kids like me ended up learning Spanish, because for me, it was a lot of music,
cool.
like literally learning how to dance, not just family parties, but in school, church, other ways informally, and being sent to like, other countries, like for the summer. And I wanted to see if you had run across that, those two things, or any other ways that people informally kind of learn their Spanish.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the question so much. So a lot of what I'm talking about in this book, right, the technical term nowadays would be heritage speakers, which is a term that really clicked with me when I first heard it, and often does with other people, because it gives us a home, right? Because we're bilinguals, but we're not sort of this like mythical balanced bilingual where you speak like 100% English perfectly and then like 100% Spanish perfectly, or Korean or whatever. Because as linguists, we know that that's not actually true. Like your head is not two water bottles. We do not fill up both sides. The languages do not cancel each other out, right? Which sounds ridiculous, but these common sense ideas are still out there. Like parents are still being told, oh, your kid's going to be confused if you speak a different language to them at home, which is weird if you think about it, because if you play, let's say, the piano and you decide to take up the violin, nobody is like, oh, that's going to cancel each other out. You better be really careful that your kid doesn't get confused, because they're going to end up unable to play any musical instrument. Like learning is learning, and yet we sort of, we get weird and illogical when it comes to language, precisely because it's so personal, I think. So heritage speaker is a term that came out of education to address the needs of people who are bilingual, but not, sort of traditionally bilingual, right? And this was really important because if you're bilingual, you typically do speak your languages differently, right? You might be stronger in one or the other, or maybe one you have like really, really good comprehension, but you get kind of tongue-tied when you try to speak, or you have excellent pronunciation and everyone who hears you thinks like, oh, they're going to be like a perfectly fluent native speaker, but then you don't have the higher vocabulary and they're like, oh, womp womp. Actually, you must have been born here, huh? Right? Stuff like that. So heritage speaker gives you kind of a home for that. And a way to address like the different learning profiles of people. And that's exactly what you're describing, right? If you learn your language mostly outside of the classroom, spoiler, gives you a lot of issues when you then take Spanish 101 or Mandarin 101 and they give you a test and they're like, okay, conjugate these in a list in the preterite. No. You're like, the what? Or put this into the conditional. The what? And, for the native English speakers out there, I would challenge us to think on the spot, put something into the subjunctive, the past subjunctive in English. I'll wait. You don't think in that way when you learn a language naturally. But the more of that environmental support you have from home, from social networks, the traditional in-person kind, not just online, right? Nowadays, from social media, digital technology that lets you keep in touch with family in other countries, depending on your family situation along a lot of parameters, your ability to go back to the country of origin or to go and study abroad and things like that. All those things help with language maintenance. And people talked about them. Spanish also tends to be a language that's pretty well maintained compared to other immigrant languages in the United States. I'm going to put immigrant in quotes there because it's not an immigrant language in the United States. It's been here actually longer than English. But, because of the Latino population is so big and we have so much active back and forth with Latin America, it tends to be preserved better across generations than, let's say, Chinese. Probably also has something to do with sharing an alphabet. But a lot of that has to do with, just having that informal language support that you talked about, minus prejudice, right? And one thing that people talked about in the DMV was that they actually generally felt like it was pretty good here in terms of the rest of the country. People said things like, I lived somewhere else before and it was nice, but it wasn't the same. Or they often compared the DC situation to down south. And they said, well, it's not as racist here as down south or further out in Virginia. So there was sort of the sense that even with all the issues that there are in the area, there is a sort of genuine interest and support for multiculturalism. Around here, we also have a ton of bilingual schools, which probably helps. Long answer. Thanks for the question.
Hi there. I first want to say you are making my little linguist heart very happy.
Yeah, yay.
You were like past conditional, and I was like, if I were to have gone to the... I'm an ESOL teacher here in
cool.
DC. I've been teaching, I taught in Pennsylvania and New Jersey before, but I've been here for almost 10 years, have worked K through 6 and also taught adults.
Oh, cool.
And I'm wondering if you could speak to any interviews you conducted where parents talked about their children's educational experience. I really appreciated that first question too, because I'm in a position of transition. I've been an ESOL teacher and I'm going to be a gen ed teacher for the first time this coming year, in part because I feel like gen ed teachers run the gamut with how welcoming they are to the ESOL teacher and the work that the ESOL teacher does. And I'm kind of to the point where estoy harta, I'm just, I want to run my own classroom because I want to welcome the ESOL teacher in. And I've had enough of experiences where that doesn't happen. And I feel like that also impacts on the kids, right? Like if you're not welcoming me in as the ESOL teacher, what are you doing for the students? And so I'm wondering what you heard from parents and families here in DC and what lessons can we as teachers take from that?
It's not in the book, but I've definitely heard about that from people. I'd say that in general in the United States, it's a problem, right? And there's a lot of wonderful things, but a lot of things that could use some attention also in our education situation in general. But yeah, there is a tendency for ESL or ESOL or ELL stuff to be marginalized, for it to be stigmatized, even amongst students themselves. Although there's also some very interesting research on those classrooms that shows that, speaking of kind of covert prestige or prestige that's very particular to a certain context or community, Spanish actually is apparently a language of prestige in diverse ESL classrooms in a lot of places in the country because kids are coming from all over, and what's the main language in their ESL classroom? It's Spanish. So they actually think it's cool and they all want to learn it. And anecdotally, I have found that a lot of immigrants do learn Spanish and they're quite open to it. Because there's just so much contact with the Latino community. And I suppose also if you're coming from somewhere else and you're already learning more languages, maybe you're a little bit more open to it.
We're not a bilingual school, but we do have Spanish as an elective. So even our students who come, our second largest ESOL group is Amharic speakers, but they're still taking Spanish, as part of their specials.
That is a unique aspect. Sorry, I don't mean to point my finger at you. To the DC area too, and something that comes up a lot is, we're not just talking about Spanish when we're talking about bilingualism and ESL around here. Of course, please.
Oh, a general education teacher. So like a regular education teacher as opposed to a special education or an ESOL teacher.
What is the ESOL teacher?
English as a second language. There's lots of different acronyms. MLL is the current one, but yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know if I answered your question. It's not in the book, but yeah, it's sort of an ongoing thing. And of course, the question of allocation of resources and perception, that's an ongoing thing.
I wondered if anyone in your book talked about the confusion of being mistaken for being from other places, because people often confuse nationality and race. And I was in DC long enough to see a time when Salvadorians might have been insulted by being considered light-skinned African Americans, or people, light-skinned African Americans, finding people assumed they spoke Spanish when they'd been in the city for generations because of class. Sometimes the colorism meant that there are a lot of people who look like Dr. Hernandez who are not from any other country other than Northwest, you know. So I just wondered if anyone spoke to that about being mistaken for other things or other people.
Definitely colorism came up. And thank you so much for the question. That was also something that came up, that sort of came up more broadly in the community as people sort of are reflecting on who we are and what was the past and what is the legacy. And I'm throwing the word community around here a lot too. I'm not saying that there's just one. Again, this whole idea that there's multiple narratives and that there doesn't have to be one that wins. We can hold two things at the same time. Multiple stories can be valid at the same time, is sort of an important one to note there. But people absolutely talked about that. You know, they talked about things like Afro-Latinidad being sort of erased, which is sort of an ongoing debate in the community as well. There's been a lot more activism around it in recent years, like the DC Afro-Latino caucus and stuff. People saying, hey, you know, the Central American narrative is a big one, and deservedly so, because a lot of people came in the 80s and it was transformative, but people were here before, like Caribbean people, Afro-Latinos were really foundational in the start of this community. In fact, many of the early organizers were Caribbean and were Afro-Latinos, a lot of Puerto Ricanos. Some of them used the sort of like relative privilege they had with citizenship to really advocate for formalizing stuff for the community. You know, a lot of Cubans. There were a lot of people involved. So that was something that came up a lot. Well, not a lot, but it came up. And then also, sorry, go ahead.
And I'm sorry, but that actually happens to me. That when I see another person that it's like a little bit afro light skin, I think that they're from Puerto Rico.
Right.
And I start to, especially people from the north of Africa.
Yeah, well, it happens within the Black community where people from an African country will be insulted when people think they're African American. They're like, no, I'm from Guinea-Bissau or whatever.
Yeah, the social indexicalities are so layered, right? And it's, you know, when you go a few steps back to somebody who's not as close to it, you know, a lot of that subtlety gets lost, but amongst people, it's absolutely there. And that was also something people talked about among Latinos, right? We floated a little bit this idea of sort of like language hierarchies and why. You know, it doesn't, as you pointed out, come from nowhere, right? It comes from these race and class and sort of intersectional historical connections. And I had mentioned, right, that I think it's important to look at multilingual repertoires holistically, right? Because it didn't stop, right? It wasn't like language attitudes were just about Spanish. They were also about English. There was that same dynamic of local pride, but also an awareness of sort of an uncomfortableness with Black English as maybe not being very correct. And people would make parallel
I think
comparisons.
the classic example now is the Pope, whose mother's line was African American, Haitian, whatever, from New Orleans, but passed as Spanish. Because it was easier to be Spanish than to be.
Yeah. So the lines sort of are blurred and yet very much maintained. And one thing that people mentioned too, especially people who came sort of in the 80s, was that DC was a very segregated city even then. And it continues to be a very segregated city, right? But people would literally say, and this is in quotes from my book, but also in quotes that say Jessica Greaser wrote a wonderful book called The Black Side of the River about linguistics in Anacostia a few years back. It's almost the same quote where people said, on this side of the river, you never saw any white people. This was the dividing line. You never saw white people on this side of the city. But they also talked about colorism among Latinos as well.
Hi. I'm just having a few thoughts about bilingualism and code switching. I worked as an interpreter, and one of my colleagues said to me, I'm trilingual. I speak English, Spanish, and Spanglish. Because the mixture is really interesting, which you have talked about many times. And then I had a thought about bilingualism that I don't know if it's scientifically accurate or not, but I've always had the feeling that my personality changes with respect to what language I'm speaking. I feel like when I'm speaking English, I'm pretty aggressive. When I'm speaking Spanish, I'm much more timid and deferential. And when I'm speaking French, I'm sort of confused. But is there any scientific basis for that?
Whew. That's a good question. I'm seeing a lot of audience response here. So I'm thinking that people, we're well-rounded, right? Things are different. I will preface that. I will hedge by saying that's not my area of expertise. So I don't know about the scientific literature on it. But certainly people do seem to feel differently about their languages. They have different emotional relationships with their languages. Being a sociolinguist, I would tend to say that those things are contextual, right? So part of it could be proficiency, like which language do you just feel more comfortable speaking? But a lot of it is probably how and where you're used to speaking the language and in what ways. We pick up these pragmatic norms, which is like politeness and deference and oftentimes very gendered behavior, right? With all their little linguistic bells and whistles like higher pitch or, creaky voice or, dropping your volume, something like that as part of that parcel of how we learn the language. In classrooms, maybe a little more artificially, right? We probably can all remember a textbook also that was sort of telling you sort of like phrases to use to sound more native when you go there. Or, in country X, they don't shake hands or something like that. Sort of very clunky intercultural communication stuff. But you also pick it up mostly just from interacting with people, right? Everything from the very, very complicated grammar that Japanese uses to encode like honorifics and gender and age and all that kind of stuff, to things like, how much your voice goes up at the end of a question or something. And if you don't do it right, people think you're being aggressive or sulky, right? So all of those things probably play into the sort of persona, in a sense, that we have in the different languages that we speak.
But I think much of it is cultural. Like I knew a woman who grew up in Spain.
Sure.
And she came to the United States, and her boyfriends would be upset because she wouldn't look them in the eye.
Oh, really?
She looked down. And
Oh, interesting.
That happens in court too. People, for out of respect, will not look the judge
Sure.
in the eye, not because they feel guilty or anything, but just because you're not supposed to look directly at people who are your superiors or.
Oh, absolutely. That's part of intercultural pragmatics. And thinking about the school thing too, right? This is a place where unconscious bias comes out, right? The way that we grow up is sort of what we are used to thinking is normal and correct. And it happens on the spot, right? I mean, if you have an interaction with somebody on the street and you think, oh, how rude. It's really hard to put that pause in there and be like, well, walk a mile in their shoes. Probably they're having a bad day. Maybe their culture is different. You just think, oh, how rude. Like they didn't make eye contact with me or say good morning or something like that. That's actually something people said a lot in the book, is that in the city, they think newcomers are rude. They said people used to say good morning. That was DC. We say good morning. We said hi. Now these gentrifiers come and they're on their phones all the time and no one says hello. But that eye contact thing is actually huge, because some cultures, you're not supposed to look people in the eye. It's considered very rude. And this often happens with kids in schools from, say, indigenous Latin American backgrounds, where they don't make eye contact and they get pegged as having something wrong with them. Oh, they're not engaged. Oh, they've got a developmental disability, something like that, especially girls. But actually, it can be culture. And it's, in another context, it's the correct thing to do. Asians get it a lot, too.
I just want to say thank you for writing a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah. And it's going to help everybody doing research and learning about Latinas and Latinos. Thank you.
Gracias. Thank you so much. Ay, gracias.
And I think with that, we are closing out. Am I right? I'm looking at the events coordinator.
We're looking at Lily like she's going.
But I think Dr. Amelia Tseng will be available to sign copies of your books, and I'm sure open to more questions.
Oh, absolutely. Let's keep talking. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you all.
And thank you for moderating.
All right. Thank you.